This is the Killer Innovations Podcast with Phil McKinney. Keep in mind that the information and opinions expressed in this podcast are Phil's, and Phil's alone, and they don't necessarily reflect those of his past, current, or future employers. Now, here's Phil McKinney.
Welcome to this week's podcast. This is not going to be one of the normal podcasts that we typically put out. The focus for this podcast is going to be on giving you some of the background on my recently released book, Beyond the Obvious, Killer Questions That Spark Game-Changing Innovation, published by Hyperion. The book was released yesterday. It's now available in bookstores. You can also download it from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, and as of this morning, I woke up to the surprise that you can actually now download it in audio form. Now, I'll warn you, it's not my voice. They hired somebody else to actually read my book, so if you're used to listening to my voice on the podcast, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I didn't do the audio. Now, what is the context of the book? Now, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you know of my passion around teaching innovation and mentoring around innovation. But one of the emails that I've gotten a lot over the last couple of months for people who've been interested in the book and wanting to understand a little bit of the history. The book actually started not only with the podcast, which started 6 years ago, but you can actually go back 6 years prior to that, about a dozen years ago. It all started during a gap in my employment. I had just cashed out at a very successful position at a very successful company, decided to cash out my stock and take some time off, basically to reflect a little bit on my career, kind of think about what I wanted to do next, but also to spend time with my kids who were about ready to go to college at that point in time. Now, during that downtime, one of the questions that I was asking myself was what was the secret behind my career success? Was there some kind of fundamental skill, some fundamental knowledge that I had? Now, up until that point, I kind of had the same mental model that a lot of people had, which was highly creative, highly innovative people were just blessed with the gene. You got it. You got the gift. God blessed you. They didn't bless me. As I went through and I started doing the reflection and really thinking about that, I figured out that kind of view was a real fallacy. It's bogus. Innovation, creativity is a skill. It's a skill that anybody can learn, anybody can practice, and anybody can become proficient at. The problem is we don't teach it anymore. We don't teach critical thinking skills. We don't teach creativity. We take out all of those things out of the class curriculum in order to, in many cases, just teach them so they can pass the test and therefore get the grade and get the degree and move on. Creativity and innovation is a critical skill set. And when I started really looking at what was it, we can get through all the esoterics of human ingenuity and inspiration and those types of things. But when I spent and really looked at it for those 2 years, trying to understand what was it that really unlocked that human power to look at a problem and come up with alternative and highly creative answers or solutions to that problem, was in the form of asking questions. Questions have a unique property. Questions are, when you ask a question to somebody, they cannot stop their brain from answering it. Now, they may not verbalize the answer back to you, but as soon as you answer a question, they are in that mode of their brain is clicking along trying to answer it. One of the questions I ask in the classes and the workshops I teach about innovation is, what is half of 13? Now, in your case, your brain has probably already processed it. You've come up with the answer, 6.5. And that's correct. If you were taking a test, you'd write down 6.5, you'd get the correct score, get the A, and move on. What's unique, though, about killer questions, or questions that really force you to look at the problem in a unique and different way, is to look beyond that obvious answer. Now, even in something as simple as what is half of 13, there is more than one correct answer. If I had written the word out 13 and said, what is half of 13, you would say THIR, split it, TEN. If I had written out the Roman numeral 13 and asked you to say, what's half of 13, you'd come back with 11 and 2 if you split it vertically. If you split a Roman numeral 13 horizontally, it's Roman numeral 8 and 8. And there's literally hundreds of answers to this question. In fact, I've had listeners to this podcast email me all the answers that they could come up with, and some teachers and professors have run this experiment in their classrooms and literally have come back with hundreds of answers. Now, what's the key is to train our brains not to stop at the obvious answers, but to go beyond the obvious, go beyond what everybody else is doing and look deeper, go further, and really uncover those new opportunities or those new ideas that other people don't look at. And the key is in constructing questions that force you to look at the problem in a unique and different way. Now, the way I like to think about really these unique questions or these killer questions is if someone pitches me a question and I think about it and I have an immediate answer or an immediate opinion, I immediately run the risk of jumping to the obvious. I like questions that force me to get myself up out of my chair and go look at something, go do some research, go observe, go talk to people, because that's where the discovery process happens. Sitting at your desk and looking at market research studies or looking at some spreadsheet that tells you, how many middle-income consumers buy your product is not the approach that's going to get you to finding those really next breakthrough innovations. So, 12 years ago, I started putting together this thought about the power of questions and started collecting questions and testing questions and running test workshops and seeing what kind of ideas came out of what questions. And I've kind of solidified this down to a list of about 60, 65 questions that tend to be very, very powerful and very universal from the standpoint of how they apply. Now, I've been sharing those in some form or another in this podcast and in my workshops, etc. Now, when I started getting to the point of sitting down and putting together the book, what I found is a lot of my questions were focused on what I found useful in my day-to-day job, which is developing technologies or developing software or whatever my background was, and they weren't generic enough. So I sat down and literally rewrote all of the questions and came up with an entirely new set of questions that I've never asked or shared before. So in the book, more than half of the questions that are presented in the book have never been discussed and have never been presented before in any form. Now, these questions are generic. You can apply them to a technology company, to a bank, to a grocery store, to independent booksellers, to the ice cream shop. One of the things I teach in my workshops is how to use the killer questions in a family setting to come up with better ideas for where to go on vacation next year. The key here is that these questions force you to look at opportunities in different ways. Look at it beyond the kind of normal way that you normally get stuck. And let's face it, we all get stuck in the rut. We all get stuck in the process of coming up with and developing new ideas, but we always tend to apply the exact same answers to those new ideas. That worked 6 months ago, it worked a year ago, it'll work again now. And we never kind of get out of that rut. And really the purpose of these questions is to get you out of the rut, to get you beyond the obvious answer that everybody else comes up with and come up with something that's going to be really game-changing, something that's going to fundamentally change your career-wise, change your organization from its success-wise, and really transform your entire industry. It's not about just coming up with innovations, but coming up with game-changing innovations is really what the whole purpose of asking these questions. So, fast forward, built these questions, tested them. I've presented to them you in the podcast over the last 6 years. And one of the common questions I've gotten over the last maybe 4 or 5 years is Phil, when are you going to come up with a book? Well, the whole purpose of this podcast is to share with you the book is done. It's now available. But how did the book actually come about? It started in the spring of 2010 when I received one of those random emails via my blog with somebody who I never had talked with, didn't know, suggesting that I write a book. And I immediately replied to them and said, yeah, great idea. 2 arms, 2 legs, 24 hours a day. And, by the way, I have an 80-hour-a-week job as the Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at HP's $40 billion personal systems group. There just isn't any time to even think about it, plus all the work I was doing in the podcast and everything else. And he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Finally, I took a meeting with him. We had the discussion. Turns out he's a literary agent, Mark Gerald. By the way, he's now my agent. And we had this discussion, and Mark actually put together a team that went through all of the podcasts, all of the blogs, all my idea notebooks, and really pulled together the construct of what became the original nucleus of an idea. We went out, had some discussions. We ended up striking a partnership with Hyperion, who now is publishing the book, to put this material together and to make it broadly available in book form and in audio and ebooks, those types of things. And really the purpose here is to unveil or rip away kind of that bad assumption that innovation and creativity is restricted to the select few and that it's really not available to the broad audience. The book is designed to be used by, again, anything from small businesses to multinationals to large governments. In fact, one of the case studies in the book talks about the testing that we've been doing with killer questions to innovate the U.S. education system, which could really benefit from some innovation. So we designed the book to really be for a broad audience, has lots of stories in it. And again, it's really in reaction to the number of emails that you have sent me asking me about the book and when am I going to get down to writing a book. You love the blog, you love the podcast, but you wanted something that you could consume in one sitting and or something that you could very easily share with other people. So the book is done. It's out. And I'm anxious to hear your thoughts and your feedback after you've had a chance to read the book. You can go to, if you want more information on the book specifically, you can go to the book's website, which is beyondtheobvious.com. And you can look through. There's actually one entire chapter that we're making available for download. You can read it. There's also a number of questions that I would have loved to have gotten into the book. They just didn't make the cut. And so I've made those available also on that site. So 6 questions that did not make it into the book. You can actually download it by visiting beyondtheobvious.com. So hopefully you found this background, this history, a little bit of the context of questions useful. I'm going to be putting out a series of podcasts going into a little bit more detail in some of the specific chapters to give you kind of the story behind the story. So come back or subscribe so that you get all of the kind of the background stories behind the podcast. And again, drop me a note, feedback at philmckinney.com on any of your comments on the book, questions you have, things that you would want me to answer in a future podcast about the book or anything else that's going on. And hopefully you found this useful. And again, thank you. If you've been a long-time listener to the podcast, buy the book, open up to the acknowledgement section, and you'll see a shout-out in the acknowledgement section to the long-time listeners of the podcast and my appreciation for the support that you've given me over the 6 years that I've been putting out the podcast. So again, thank you for your time, and look forward to hearing your feedback. Bye-bye.